Hey Ishan, what are we talking about today?
What's up, Matt? So today's topic, why and how civilizations slash empires collapse. And today's game, Marvel Rivals. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the Salon Mondial, aka the World Salon, where we discuss interesting topics over great games. So yeah, as we sort of just alluded to, we're going to be talking about empires and civilizations and sort of why they collapse, talk about some examples from the past, of course, and really connected to what's going on today with the United States of America. So yeah, Matt, any thoughts you have about just general civilizations collapse? Anything interesting that you've been reading lately?
No opening thoughts. There was one thing you wanted to talk about, right? You were mentioning earlier. Why don't we start with that?
Yeah, of course. I think of course, we're living in a very interesting time now. Of course, if you're following just geopolitics, regular news, that's the current state of of just the world, right? With Trump's tariffs, just the pause on global trade. Of course, this sense of just discontent amongst the population, especially amongst the youth, right? This sense that, hey, things aren't as great as they used to be. There's a sense that things are kind of slipping out of control, at least here in the United States, right? That clearly people are very much resonating with, right? Which is why people have been asking a lot, right? Is the U.S. empire, if you can call it an empire, in decline, right? And I think that's
empire and asterisks.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thought to have, right? Because I think it's, if you look at the general statistics of what makes a civilization sort of successful, I think the U.S. is still pretty much kind of on top of it, right? In terms of economy, of course, the U.S. drives everything. In terms of, I would say culture, still to an extent, that's waning. I think we've also been talking about that, Matt, in the past, about how, I think the stronghold that the U.S. had in terms of Hollywood, in terms of music, in terms of all of that, has definitely waned, with the rise of other local industries like kick dramas and Latin pop and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think from all perspectives, right, it looks like the U.S. is kind of on top, but it's kind of interesting when you look back on history, right, where, we assess, empires that are in decline, even though at that point they still were kind of on top of the world. So
Yeah.
I think it's not really.
Yeah. Well, actually, I do have things to say about this part. So I went to a really interesting wealth management kind of discussion with a bunch of. It was just a bunch of fund managers getting together and just talking about the state of the world and the state of geopolitics and where we're headed, as a species. And the big debate on the table at the discussion was really whether the U.S. is following the footsteps of the British Empire, because there's basically there's one really crude way of looking at the world along the lines of what's called stagil theory, which is just it's just the idea that civilization develops in different stages. So you have Neolithic, Paleolithic, agricultural revolution, and then the Age of Empires, and then within the Age of Empires, every kind of 100 of years, there's a kind of handoff. And so the most recent handoff obviously was between the British and the American Empire in around the early 20th century, 1910s, 1920s. People debate around when exactly the U.S. Empire took over, and there's also important questions about what dimension are we talking about? Because if you want to talk about economics, for example, the American economy technically overtook the British Empire in the late 20th, in the late 19th century.
Ray Dalio.
And then around the around the 1880s.
The British sterling pound as the most
Yeah.
currency.
No. So that's a thing. Or what year was Ray Dalio saying? I'm just curious.
No, he just
I haven't heard that. But
he has a whole book about the changing world order, right? In terms of how he tries to map a theory of why civilizations and empires collapse. And of course, a lot of people have criticisms about it, saying hey, you can't really map it all out into some unified theory where this is true. He was basically pulling from a lot of different data points, pretty much every data point you could find, and trying to
exactly
theory or a common link, right?
Yeah.
One of them.
That's basically what Graham Allison tries to do with the Thucydides trap,
true,
right?
He looks at it from a different perspective, but absolutely, yeah, it's in a very similar vein. But what Dahlia was saying was that one of the factors that leads to an empire's decline is once their currency is no longer the strongest in the world. Yeah, and of course debt and all that. And so you're kind of saying
basically
for the British Empire that was the case, right? for the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and so there's different theories. I subscribe to the Adam 2 theory, which says that it was 1916 because that was the year when basically the Allied forces during World War One began lending huge amounts of money. And so yeah, basically I think now that the debate is over whether the U.S. is following in the footsteps of what the British Empire did 100 years ago in its collapse. And there's obviously some semblances, like you have really high debt that's being unsustainable. So all the talk now of a recession also has to do with the sovereign debt crisis. And you know, around the turn of the early 20th century, around the turn of the 20th century, basically, there's a famous book by British historian Edward Gibbon called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, which today is still one of the most widely read books on ancient Rome. And what's interesting is that, you know, he was following in this footsteps of a kind of like historical critical theory where even though he was talking about the Roman Empire, what he was really talking about was the British Empire. So it was almost like, yeah, exactly. He was basically, it was basically, you know, just like Dalio and Graham Allison and all these other people too. It was really a book about the rise and fall of empires, specifically looking at an ancient empire. But he was really talking about, you know, what he saw as happening to the British
So what was happening
during the Twilight.
Obviously, like I think it became too expensive to govern, right? Where I mean, people always talk about like, you know, why did the British like let go of India? Like, of course, of, you know, the freedom independence movement, right? That started in the 20s.
Yeah, exactly.
Even before that, right? But of course, it reached its zenith with Mahatma Gandhi. But if you think about it, like he went to jail in 1922, right? And like, obviously, he was released, and it was all kinds of, you know, like the,
Yeah.
just the whole thing. But it took more than 20 plus years, right? So the question becomes like, why did they let it go? And it simply became a fact that India became too expensive for the British to govern. They were better off letting it go. Like they had a very capitalist and economic view of how they ran their empire. I don't think it was very.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it just became untenable. No, I mean, really, what happened was basically they just took on way too much debt during World War One, in 1916. Because the thing is, like, you know, I mean, this goes all the way back into military theory and the start of the war. There's a great book on this, Guns of August, by Barbara Tuchman, which just covers all the drama happening and the hubris of both sides. How basically every single king thought that the war would be over within weeks. And so no one was prepared for a long, protracted war. And so by the time the war got to about year one, year two, you can just think of it as, on a very crude level, the entire economies were depleted. So, you know, you're planning for a 1 or 2 week war. You don't have the kind of like the kind of grain and ammo and steel supplies. And this was around the birth of modern war, or like what you would call quote unquote modern warfare too, where war is no longer just about how many men you can field, but also about, you know, how much steel you can put into, how many planes you can build, how many tanks you can build, all of which rely on these massive industrial, capital-intensive processes. And so basically what happened is that the British just ran out of money, and then they began having to borrow from the Americans. And so there's a shift around this time between the, you know, London for basically the 1900s from the 18 to 1900s was a center of global finance, and every country was holding on to pound sterling. And then you have the shift towards the American system, where, and funnily enough, you know, it wasn't the American government that was funding their allied powers. I mean, this gets into this all ties into our previous episode. So you can see how central the Morgan family is to the entire story. But the Morgan family basically loaned huge amounts of money, as they were the only underwriter of loans to the British and the French. They loaned them something, if you address it for today's currency values, it's in the range of about 1 trillion, which is completely mind-boggling. So you have a single bank essentially loaning about $1 trillion worth of arms to, at the time, the largest financial power in the world. And so what happened off the back of that is the British just went bankrupt. You know, they had like what you would call a sovereign debt crisis,
But that's happening
and then
right now, right? In terms of
yeah,
since the 2000s.
well, that's
happening so much.
that's a big debate. That's a big debate. So at that meeting I mentioned, you know, basically some people in the room were saying, you know, the debt's untenable. If there's one thing that's true, you know, a country can't hold on to so much debt. But I think, I mean, first of all, I think that we shouldn't jump so quickly onto historical parallels.
Right.
I mean, history obviously is a great teacher, and I adhere to that strongly as a historian. But at the same time, I think that we have to be cautious about how many parallels we can draw. And I think first of all, you know, there's really 2 points I want to make here. The first is that you know, there's an elephant in the room that you have to address when discussing the fall of British Empire, and that's the fact that they got into a completely unwinnable war. And so, and right now, I mean, you know, right now it's very possible. Like I'm in the camp of I really just don't know what's gonna happen, but I think it's entirely possible for the U.S. to go to war with China over Taiwan. I think that's very, very possible.
Right.
In this day and age.
And that would be like the equivalent of the World War II shock.
Yeah, exactly.
It's I mean.
Yeah, the World War I shock. Yeah, the financial shock. The financial shock. Yeah. Because if there's one thing, okay, if there's one thing we know about the transfer of like global hegemony, and you can also make a similar case for, you know, 1815 was kind of the year that Britain became the unequivocal power within Europe. And what strikes you about 1815, Ishan, as a hobby historian?
You're gonna have to stop.
Like, what's a significant event?
Oh, Napoleon.
Waterloo. That was when they, yeah.
Waterloo.
Yeah, that was the end of the Napoleonic Wars. It's when they beat the French at Waterloo. And then Napoleon was sent on his second exile. And so if there's one thing we know to be true, is that actually, like, periods of hegemony are created, defined, reshaped by war.
Exactly.
And so in the absence of war,
And so, but that
yeah, exactly. There has to be some kind of war, or there has to be some kind of like what you would call, like what people in finance like to call like a black swan event. And so that's also why I'm skeptical that, you know, I don't think that, because I mean the thing is the U.S. has been running a deficit for so long. It's not like one day it's suddenly gonna crack. I think that you're gonna need like a lot of pushing and a lot of brute force. Tariffs may not even be enough. Like you really need some major black swan event, I think, that causes people to look for safety in other currencies. Because at the end of the day, you know, for all of its problems, the U.S. is still like the least worst currency.
That's true.
Like I've heard it put that way before, and I think that's like a really useful, like, useful saying for understanding what's going on.
But that's
Oh, and then the other point, yeah.
I mean, you're bringing up an interesting point. I mean, talking about,
Yeah.
first of all, right, like there is definitely a sense within the U.S. that things are collapsing. There's like a moral civic decay, right? Like decreased trust in institutions, right? A decline just in a sense of polarization, no sense of national unity. There's definitely a loneliness epidemic, a depression epidemic amongst the youth. Just a sense that things are not what they used to be, right? That's why Trump got elected, right? And you brought an interesting point that, like, you know, despite having all these kind of telltale signs that we could even draw parallels to history, right? Like, okay, increased polarization, like, you know, we're going to kind of get more into those factors, but there has to be some kind of a, you know, World War I cataclysmic event, like one actual war that would basically signal the actual transfer of hegemony. And I think you're absolutely right that there's going to have to be some flashpoint that has to erupt in order for that official transition, because it's never a transition. It's always a brutal transition. I don't think the British Empire wanted to let go of all of its colonies, nor did all of Europe for them.
Yeah, no, they did.
Were forced into the current position that they're in, right? The same way that the Indian civilizations and empires were forced to become the stooges of the British. They didn't voluntarily just give up, right? Like, it almost always happened due to physical conflict, right? Like, even if it was declining and decaying for like 20, 30, 40 years, there had to be like that moment where, oh man, like shit really hit the fan. Like, a very good example that I can pull from very quickly before I want to hear your next point is if we look at the Mughal Empire in India, right? Like, people definitely point the decline to the rule of Aurangzeb and he died in 1707 after ruling for 50 years. And he basically
Give some context on who's Aurangzeb.
about the Mughal Empire. Obviously, it was under Aurangzeb. It had the highest GDP. Actually, it commanded most of the GDP in the world, like more than 40%, even more than China at the time, more than the Qing Empire. The word Mughal comes from the word Mughal, right? Like it was the richest empire. These guys built the Taj Mahal. It was just flowing with jewels and silks and everything, and it was, one of the three times.
An interesting tidbit: they were Mongolian, right?
Well, not Mongolian.
They were like.
This guy came
I
from
thought they.
Pakistan.
Yeah, the first. Yeah, but he was a distant cousin of like, or he was a distant descendant of. Yeah, exactly. I read Kublai Khan, but I guess that's the same.
No, it was Genghis Khan.
Yeah.
His mother's side, father's side, it was Tamerlane. Yeah, that was Babur. He founded the industry in the empire in 15 something, 20s or 17. I can't remember the exact date. But yeah, India's only been unified 3 times in its history, essentially, and the Mughals were one of those times. And Aurangzeb basically expanded the entire empire from all the way in the northwest, right, all the way from parts of modern day, even Afghanistan, all the way down to the south, right to the tip where Tamil Nadu is. Basically, he overexpanded the empire. He caused a little bit of religious intolerance. This was a Muslim empire, and of course, it's a Hindu majority land, so there's a lot of internal kind of revolt, fragility, and basically, yeah, like upon his death, the empire was still literally like extremely rich, right? Like by the time, and even after he died in 1707, his son succeeded for 5 years and he died. Then another guy came in for a year. Then another guy came in for it was basically internal chaos. And it only kind of got back to some kind of stability by 1720 when Muhammad Shah Rangila became the emperor. And this, even now, right, they still pretty much ruled almost all the subcontinent for the Peacock Throne, right? And even though it had been in decline, it still ruled extremely rich and fertile lands. Like its capital, Delhi, with 2 million inhabitants, was still larger than London and Paris combined, right? It was still the most prosperous and magnificent city, if you think of it, between like Ottoman Istanbul and all the way to Tokyo. So even though people knew this empire was declining, it really didn't collapse until Nader Shah invaded in 1739. Nader Shah was this Afghan warlord who destroyed the Persian Empire, the Safavids. He came after the Mughals. He basically looted, burned, and raped the entire city. And only then did the British realize, oh my God, the Mughals are super weak. Like now's the time to start tearing them apart, right? Like
Yeah.
you're so right that there needs to be that Nader Shah moment, right? That World War I moment.
Yeah. No, and to bring this back to the British example, like, even though, okay, so let's say we take the Two's thesis at face value and 1916 was the inflection point. There was still like a 50-year process of decolonization. It's not like the British Empire just like blew up overnight. It's like there was, and in fact, it was the Americans too that basically helped walk them to the grave. So during World War II, when the British found themselves in another unwinnable war, they had to again rely on the American financial system. And in I think it was 1940, you had like what's called the Atlantic Charter signed between Churchill and Roosevelt, which basically just said that the U.S. would support Britain in the war on the condition that in the event of victory, they give up colonial holdings.
Wow.
And it wasn't because the Americans, yeah, and this was and remember, this was a document before the U.S. even joined the war. So that's why, and the U.S., they don't join the war until 1941 because of Pearl Harbor, and initially they only joined the war against Japan. So
Interesting.
that's also why there's so much speculation about like to what extent Roosevelt was planning for the war. No, and this is also why for a long time historians actually believed what's called the backdoor to war thesis, which was just the idea that Roosevelt actually orchestrated Pearl Harbor.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's completely crazy. I mean, it's like, it's like Bush and 9/11 theories, but the thing is, like, there was for a long time like legitimate historians actually believe this. And it was because of things like the Atlantic Charter,
Right.
and because of Roosevelt's tacit support for the Allied forces during the war, and the reason for all that, and basically everything we just talked about is just markets.
Mm-hmm.
Like the U.S. is a large financial empire, or a large growing financial empire with a huge domestic economy that wants to export goods to the rest of the world. And the problem with empires is that they work on a form of mercantilism, where basically they just trade with the mother country.
Right.
And so the thing is, empires are bad for, like, quote unquote U.S. empire, because the U.S. is a free trade empire. And so a free trade empire needs free trade, which means that, if the world is carved up into a series of different empires or economic blocks, it would basically preclude the U.S. from trading with them. And so this was kind of the economic logic behind the Atlantic Charter and behind why the U.S. was supporting decolonization. I mean, on some level, there is, you could argue that there was a quixotic element or some form of idealism, in the sense that the U.S. wanted to extend, democratic values. But at the same time, you have to remember that, the U.S. was pretty much a Jim Crow state until 1965. And so, and so that's where, that's why there's so many layers to the story, and why you can see how, on some level, it was really just economic drivers. Um, and at times, I mean, of course, when they were going overseas, they would market it as liberators. But, for a lot of the African American soldiers fighting within the U.S. military, and, even the Asian Americans who were concentrated in, I mean, who were basically rounded up into camps in places like California, it didn't look so idealistic. And so, yeah, and so I think there's many different layers to the story, but I mean, to bring it back to your point, some
100%.
parts of the world, some parts of the world didn't even decolonize until the 1960s.
Yeah.
I mean, the British were helping to stabilize Southeast Asia pretty much until the 1960s. Like, you had the
Yep.
Dynasty, and then the Malay emergency in Singapore and Southeast Asia. Again, going back to our point last time.
I want to connect it back to the Athenian Empire. So I think you brought up a really interesting point about, kind of the ideals and values of the U.S. and sort of why they went to war. And I think there's a really great example kind of from history, right, about Athens versus Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. No, I think now's a good time to kind of quickly segue into, I think, like Athens and the Peloponnesian War, right? Between Sparta and Athens. This was 431 to like 404 BCE, right? Of course, Thucydides was the famous writer, but it's very interesting, right? When you talk about, when you kind of compare the U.S. fighting for its values and, and joining the war, right, for moral reasons, or at least like why it's sort of established its empire. Very similar to kind of how Athenian democracy, right, was basically, like driving its foreign policy by its values, right? In terms of, we want to liberate all of Greece, we want to spread democracy. And then Sparta, of course, was authoritarian, and they also wanted to, in their own words, liberate Greece from Athenian, imperialism.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, again, I think this gets back to the different dimensions of, how we talk about what's going on right now, because, I think there's an economic dimension, a political dimension, there's a cultural dimension, and, there's different theories which subscribe to how each of these different facets affect what's going on, and depending on which theory you subscribe to will then change, I think, how you diagnose, the larger issues. And so the Athens versus Sparta angle falls into like what's called the Thucydides trap thesis by Graham Allison in his book Destined to War, which basically just argues that on some level it's just structural, and then nothing else really matters. But anyways, that's an entire conversation.
Yeah, just a quick.
Exactly. It's whenever you have
inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta, right? Obviously, alluding to the U.S. versus China. The U.S. is a democracy. No, Athens, Sparta is the authoritarian regime, which is China.
No, and basically the whole thesis is that whenever you have a hegemon, and you have a rising hegemon, those two powers are naturally going to go into conflict. Yeah. But then again, British and America are again a very interesting counterpoint, and it's one that Allison acknowledges in his book, because Britain was the rising hegemon, but they actually, remained became and remained very close allies with the U.S.
That's true. There are
So
plenty of things, right?
it's not so much, yeah, so it's not so much like a hard law in the sense of like the natural sciences, but it's more just kind of it's more of like a general theory which has like some like stochastic variance.
I think to sort of
So,
tie it all,
but anyways, this is a
I
whole,
think to tie it all together,
yeah,
right? We've sort of discussed like the sort of anxiety people are feeling with the United States of America, and of course with Trump, you know, a lot of his sort of erratic behaviors, like with the tariffs, some of his, you know, his isolationist policies, anti-NATO, anti-EU, anti just institutional stances are definitely causing a lot of people to sort of, you know, look at the U.S. more, just in terms of like, hey, like maybe things are changing a lot, right? Of course, you got the decline of Hollywood, the decline of like American music and pop culture, right? Other parts of the world have their own stuff that they're interested in. But I think the one thing we can kind of conclude on is that, you know, despite all these factors, right, there has to be that sort of shock moment, that World War I moment, that Nader Shah of Persia moment where they invade Delhi, they plunder the Peacock Throne, they take the Kohinoor Diamond and they, you know, loot the city to the ground. There has to be that moment, right? And even after that moment, it will still kind of chug along for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right, before official decolonization, right? But I think what we're waiting for is that sort of war, right? Where I think it kind of hits the fan. What do you think?
yeah. No, that's well said. I think we'll, you know, this is definitely a much longer conversation, and we can leave it open to a future input.
Absolutely.
So,
Well, thanks everyone for joining this on Mondial. We're going to keep putting out some more videos. Let us know in the comments on specific topics you'd like us to discuss. I'm Ishan, and that's Matt. And yeah, we will see you guys all next time.